Hello everyone, and welcome to the 21st episode of TechLifeSkills with Tanmay. My name is Tanmay Bakshi. Thank you very much for joining in today. And in today's show, we are going to dive into the culture that acts as what I believe is the infrastructure, or you could call it the catalyst for technological innovation. Now, you see, innovating in technology isn't really just about technology, right? Like you could have a state-of-the-art neural network, but at the end of the day, it's about transforming that or packaging it into something meaningful, something impactful, a human experience, so it really matters in the grand scheme of things. But how exactly can we actually go about doing that? Well, I believe that we have to start at the very bottom of the stack. Not the technology and not even really the organizations that build the technology, but really the people, right, within those organizations that are responsible for building up that organization, responsible for doing the work, responsible for building the technology itself. And to explore what this means, I'm very excited to introduce today's special guest, Bob Lord. Now, Bob is the Senior Vice President for Cognitive Applications at IBM. He was previously CEO of AOL and CEO of Razorfish, just to name a few of the executive positions he's held over the past 35 years. And so now, without any further ado, let's welcome Bob to the show. Hi, Bob. Thank you for joining in today. It's an honor to have you on the show.
Thanks, Tanmay. Thanks for having me. How are you today?
I'm doing very well. How are you?
Good. Family doing well in COVID?
Absolutely, it's about as good as it can be. So yeah, thank you for joining. It's wonderful. Of course, I would have loved to have you in person on the Tech Time with Tanmay series, here at the IBM Canada Lab. But unfortunately, we can't make it happen in person. But I'm
Yep.
glad that you could be a part virtually.
I appreciate you doing this, Tanmay.
Thank you,
I
thank
didn't
you.
get that.
Oh,
Could you try again?
we're talking about technology, and my Apple Watch thinks I said the wake word for Siri. But anyhow, so thank you once again, Bob, for joining in today. And before we begin, I'd really appreciate it if you could please take just around a minute, and if we could just if you could just introduce yourself and tell the audience a bit more about the work that you do before we begin our discussion.
Yeah, so Tanmay, I've only been with IBM for a short time, but I do have an engineering background, graduated with industrial mechanical engineering degree from Syracuse University. Then went off and actually implemented robots on the factory floor at General Motors and Corning Glassworks, and actually programmed in COBOL for a long time with those robots. So my 35 years, that's where I started. And then I ended up getting into the consulting business, went back for my MBA at Harvard, and then landed a job where I was running a small profit and loss organization, implementing technology in the healthcare world. And fast forward, I ended up becoming the global CEO of a digital agency in the early 2000s called Razorfish. And that was really an organization that was really questioning the status quo with technology. Could you actually take and merge creativity and technology and actually transform businesses? And that led me then down to a path of selling the company a few times, and then over to AOL to transform AOL in the programmatic media space, and then selling that business to Verizon, and then ultimately joining IBM just in the last 4 years as the chief digital officer to help Ginny and now Arvind on the transformation of IBM. So it's been a really, really rich career around this intersection of technology and business. And there used to be, years and years ago, Tommy, which you maybe will laugh about, but there used to be a technology plan and then a business plan. They didn't merge very well. And now, obviously we all can't talk about a business plan without having technology at its core, in order to transform a business. And I realized very early on that my skill set to be able to talk about technology and talk about business was a place that I thrived in, and helping companies sort of transform themselves through technology was something that I love to do. So a lot of the work that I've done at IBM has been rethinking how we go to market and how we actually transform ourselves for our customers.
Very interesting. Thank you for sharing. And you're right. It's sort of weird to think today, or at least in a market like today's, that you would have a separate business plan, a separate technology plan, whereas now it's sort of unthinkable to have two separate plans that way, right? A little while ago, I had the honor of having David Kenny, so now the CEO of Nielsen, but also was at IBM a little while ago as well, on the show. And one of the main points that Dave and I mentioned is that over time we've had to restructure even businesses to be able to leverage technology to its fullest extent. Right? Technology has all these different capabilities, but unless we structure the businesses and the things around the technology in the right way, it's hard to be able to really, saturate and use that technology to its fullest potential. Even today, there's still some ways we can sort of improve upon that, I think, and that's...
Yeah, no, look, well, just think what's happened just in the last 5 years, right? I mean, technology like an Uber platform has disrupted transportation industry and it'll never go back again. Airbnb has transformed the hotel industry, right? And that's probably because I would suggest to you that the legacy taxi companies never really embraced technology at scale. Or I'd say to you, the hotel industry never really embraced technology at scale to disrupt themselves. So they needed an outside source. The challenge for incumbent enterprises right now, I would suggest to you, is are they embracing technology at scale so they don't get disrupted by a new entry in the market? And I think that that's really the challenging question I think all strategists now have in all these businesses.
Absolutely. It's all about being able to see where technology is headed in the future and how you can always adapt, right? And I think it's something that IBM has done really well, personally, I think, because to think that a company has been around for that long, it's gone through, tens of different transitions over the decades.
Right.
And without being able to not only, adapt, but also thrive in that adaptation, it's impossible to stay alive for that long, right? And so I think that's something that IBM happens to do really well.
Yeah. No, and I think sometimes, customer surveys and focus groups, they don't necessarily tell you where the puck is moving, right? Because sometimes the consumer doesn't know where they want to go. They just want to be surprised and delighted. And I think that is the challenge that big enterprise companies have over time.
You're right. And it kind of goes back to that Steve Jobs quote, right? Our customers don't know what they want until we show it to them. Right,
Yeah, I remember opening up my first iPod. This is how old I am, and I was just absolutely thrilled and delighted by that device. And I went from a Walkman to an iPod, and it was unbelievable. It was like the best experience I've ever had in my life. That's how you have to delight your customers nowadays.
Absolutely, you've got to have that kind of paradigm shift, right? Something that nobody expects because they can't envision it. Right, and it goes back to
even the packaging at that point.
Yeah,
I mean, that was, oh my God, just unveiling that device was just so special.
It was on the next level, right? And back with the first iPhone too, people were like, "Oh, my thumbs can't type fast on this phone because it doesn't have a physical keyboard." And Steve Jobs was like, "Your thumbs will learn." Right?
Yeah, and they did.
Yeah, in a traditional, yeah, exactly. And in a traditional business mindset, you'd be like, but wait, the customer can't use this properly. You'd think that you want to deliver a physical keyboard because that's what they can type with faster. But Apple's like, no, you'll learn. It's better. So yeah, this is interesting to see how technology and business sort of co-evolve and sort of are intertwining more and more nowadays. And I think at the end of the day, these businesses, right? Again, all of them are run by people, right? A business isn't a single entity. It's a bunch of people working together to work towards goals, forming a culture, these sorts of things, and each individual within that business has their own sort of career, their own goals that might align with the sort of company that they're a larger part of. And so my question for you is, we were starting to see technology become more and more important across industries, right? So a little while ago, I had a talk in Lisbon, and it wasn't in Spain. It was no, this was in Portugal. Okay. So it was in Portugal. And in this talk, I was like, let's just say you're going on vacation to France, right? Of course, before you go, you're going to want to learn a little bit of French so you can actually speak with the locals and, you don't have that huge communication barrier. I mean, nowadays we have translation, but ignoring that, you want to learn a little bit of the language of the people that you're going to be, working with or meeting.
100%.
And similarly, I think regardless of the industry we're in today, we're using technology. So doesn't it make sense that we would want to learn the language that technology speaks? Code, right? Because that's in every industry. So in your opinion, what exactly is the best way for people to go ahead and prepare themselves for the future in their careers?
Yeah, so, I think people very quickly start to go through a checklist of the skills that they need to develop and get very tactical about, well, I got to balance out my education with this course, or I have to go take a Python course, or I have to understand more about philosophy or whatever it may be, just to sort of beef up their skills. But what I've actually learned in my life is the first thing is to make sure whatever you're doing, you're really, really passionate about. and that you're really excited about going into work. You end up spending a third of your time at work, and you have to have some fun, and you have to really, really understand what you're doing. And early on in my career, when I first started probably at Corning Glassworks, I realized that I love change. I love sort of, and at that point, like I said, I was implementing robots on the factory floor, but it was a change of doing business, right? And I realized over those years that I loved helping businesses transform themselves and transform themselves using technology. Now, the challenge there is you can really get stuck in implementing robots, or you can learn about technology and evolve with technology as it goes along. So you needed to basically, for me, it was a passion of transformation, but it was also this attitude that I was constantly had to learn. And those two elements of me understanding that transformation was important and this mindset that I didn't know everything and that I had to continually learn from others, what I think has really helped me transform myself in my career. So if I started out as a programmer on the factory floor in Corning, New York, to somebody who took on a digital agency in the healthcare world, to the marketing world, to the media world, and then back to technology, you sort of see that cycle of me going in and out of various industries. But all of that would have never happened if I didn't have the sort of intellectual curiosity that I think is so important to anyone's career. Lots of people, Tommy, talk about IQ and EQ. The one component we need to really focus on is LQ. What is someone's learning quotient? How interested are they in actually learning something new and learning from others? And a lot of times what I find is in a lot of the career planning sessions that I go through right now is that last LQ, the ability and desire to learn, gets harder and harder as you get older. And you don't want to learn so much. And it takes effort, I mean, learning a new language or technology is not sometimes easy to do. But once you master it, you can actually then propel your career to another level. So there's this mix of being passionate about something and then really driving sort of this idea of that you're learning something. And one of the reasons why I love running the developer advocacy program at IBM is meeting people like you from all walks of life in any of our call for code programs or anything we do. And I just learn from all of these people who have fantastic ideas, and you have to keep that open mindset.
Thank you for sharing, and I really love what you mentioned about the learning quotient, right? That's such a unique way to put it, right? We've seen so many people saying, oh, it's important to be a lifelong learner, but being able to see why it's important and how we can quantify it into something like a learning quotient, I think that's really important. And I think we almost don't even give ourselves enough credit as humans. Almost, I mean, we are incredibly adaptable creatures, right? We evolved in completely different environments to where we end up living today, right? We are some of the most adaptable animals on the planet, right?
Yep.
And that goes both physically but also mentally, right? And I feel like a
Well,
good
and
example.
Tommy, just think about it. COVID hit us 6 months ago.
Yeah,
I'm sure there are more people in this world that know how to use Zoom now than they ever have before, or
absolutely.
WebEx, or how to conduct a meeting online. And that the use of digital technology just accelerated in the last 6 months, and human beings adopted to it very quickly, and people learned new technology that they wouldn't normally have learned before.
Absolutely.
One very key example.
Absolutely.
To your point.
Right, yeah, so no, that's exactly what I was mentioning, right? Like education, for example, that whole field got turned upside down. Like if you had told anybody a week before this whole sort of lockdown stuff started that we're all going to be doing online classes and whatever we're doing today, they wouldn't have believed you, right? They would have been like, how will you fundamentally shift the entire industry like this in a week, right? That they would not have believed you. But with the power of technology, it's possible. Humans are capable of it. And I mean, as you mentioned, it just fundamentally gets harder to learn things as you get older, right? And it's even down to a physiological level. Your brain is physically less adaptable as you start to get older, right? When we're born, we have all these different abilities that we don't end up using, and our brain's just like, oh, we can get rid of these extra clusters of neurons, right? Like identifying primate faces, right? We can't do that as adults.
Yeah, no, well, I would say though, when you really get down underneath this learning quotient, there's a couple of questions that people should just ask themselves retrospectively. And sometimes these are hard questions to sort of internalize yourself. But there are good questions I am now talking to all my management team about as a self-reflection piece, because it's over time I've learned these things. And the first question around this, when you think about how you help a company grow or help a company transform, is are you an inside out or an outside in thinker? And what I mean by that is in very large enterprises, sometimes we always use our own compass, or people sometimes call it navel gazing. We're always looking inside for the answer. But in the world that we're in right now, there are so many great practices out there and so much going on from a competition standpoint that you need to be an outside learner, meaning that you learn from the outside and you bring it into your organization. And one of the reasons why startups do as well as they do is because they're an outside-in look of a business problem. Why did Uber create what it created? Because they were actually looking at customer pain points and then developing a platform for it. They had an outside-in look. And if you have to, as somebody who's going to be successful in your career, you have to have that kind of perspective. And then the second question I ask my folks is, are you a know-it-all or do you learn it all? And I would say to you, sometimes people get in a room and they think they know it all. And there is a component of being smart and being the smartest person in the room. But sometimes what you need to do is you need to learn from the people who are around you. And sometimes those introverted folks that are in the room have the best insight about solving that problem than that know-it-all would have ever had. So you have to think about, how much airtime did you consume during that meeting? How much did you learn in that meeting? Even if it wasn't a technical learn, you may have learned an insight about a person, what makes them tick, what their behavior is from a change management standpoint. But I find a lot of smart people want to be the loudest voice and know it all, and that doesn't work well long-term for their career. It may get them through a short spurt, but it's not going to make it last very long for them. And then the third one I ask is, do you take feedback well? Are you candid about your feedback, or are you a yes, but kind of person? Because sometimes you have to listen to the feedback and then figure it out behind that. And then the last question is probably the most pertinent question to me. Are you a problem solver or a problem explainer? When I judge my management team, if they can't help me solve the problem and they're giving me the explanation of what's wrong, it doesn't help us move the business forward, and it doesn't help us transform at all. And it is interesting, when you ask those 4 questions to my managers, they take pause. Mm-hmm. You have to really be introspective about it. You have to get, other feedback from people, because some people aren't self-aware that they're not taking feedback well, or they think they take feedback well, but they don't take feedback well. And I do think that those 4 principles really, really help you future-proof whatever career you're going to go into, and however you're going to evolve. And they're kind of very simple, basic questions to ask, but they're really, really powerful when you really think about how you can be a successful executive and a manager in the world that we live in today.
Mm-hmm. That's so insightful to think about, right? That people aren't always self-aware. In fact, the majority of the time, I would say people usually aren't self-aware of the fact that you're right, they might not be taking feedback well. And the fact that I feel like knowledge is something that we can't really quantify. You couldn't say, hey, this guy built, loop vectorization passes for LLVM, or this is a pretty technical example, but you couldn't say that, oh, this guy built this, therefore he knows everything about LLVM, but nothing else. Right? You can't just quantify that. There have been so many times where, even at IBM, I'll go up to people and I'll, ask them questions about different pieces of technology, and you'd almost think to yourself, and they would even think to themselves, like, why do you know this exactly, right? There are little pieces of knowledge and ideas and thoughts that people have that you don't realize they have. And when you try and quantify or limit somebody's, knowledge, or even your own knowledge to something, it's limiting. So being able to be open and learn from everybody, regardless of what it is you're learning from them, even if you happen to be an expert in the field, I think is incredible, because all of us know different pieces about everything. Nobody knows everything in its entirety, right?
Yeah, tell me, sometimes the smartest person in the room is the person that asks the smartest questions.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Absolutely is.
If you just sort of pause on that thought for a minute and just say, am I actually asking a smart question to gain insight on something to help me solve the problem that I'm after right now? Mm-hmm. And I think sometimes we want to not make ourselves vulnerable and ask a question, because sometimes when you ask a question, you open yourself up to criticism. Mm-hmm. And that is a vulnerable place for you to be. But as an executive, you need to be in those vulnerable places every once in a while.
Mm-hmm.
And then that sort of creates this environment of, oh, you know what? It's okay to ask a question in these meetings.
Mm-hmm.
And we all become better as a management team around that.
Interesting. I feel like there's so many, connects that we can make down to like why we are this way, right? Like, again, we evolved in completely different environments to where we live today. In a society like today, is asking, questions that even might sound weird, or again open you to sort of criticism. That's useful. You're learning, right?
Right.
You're broadening your skill set. Up until a couple 100,000 years ago, maybe that wasn't the case. Maybe doing something that was against social norms would have gotten you kicked out of a pack of humans and you wouldn't survive in the wild, right? So there are these things that we kind of have to let go of or get rid of, down in our subconscious mind to really thrive in a modern environment, which is something that evolution sort of has to catch up to us in that sense.
And coming from the decades that I came from, right, top-down management always had the answer.
Mm-hmm.
So to live in an environment right now as a senior executive and be vulnerable would have gotten you fired 20 years ago, to your point.
Wow. Yeah.
Today, being vulnerable is actually an asset of being a great executive and inspiring great creativity out of your employees.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that that's a really a very, very interesting insight. And it is interesting, your generation, Tommy, I think normally comes with that. There's less for you to change there because the way that you've grown up in school and the work teams that you do, how you understand agile methodologies and how you actually pull squads together. So there's a natural way of being there. I think my generation has to figure out how to tap into that to get the best innovative solutions in place. And the concept of open source was never even a thought 20 years ago, right? But this idea that in an open source world, you can do a lot better innovation than you can in a research lab that's closed and contained, right?
Mm-hmm.
That open source allows you to innovate in ways and bring ideas to the table that you would have never thought about.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think there are actually so many examples of this, right? Red Hat, of course, is the perfect example, and we have sort of like the very first episode of the series actually was with ZTO, Red Hat Synergy in Asia Pacific. So we talked a lot about that, and I feel like another great example actually, which fits perfectly with the timing since IBM just announced the new Power 10 chip. Think about the Power ecosystem, right? If major software stacks for machine learning were closed source, like TensorFlow, and only worked on x86, we wouldn't have the amazing advantages of the whole Power AI ecosystem that we do now, and the fact that we have choice over what platforms we want to use, not just from a software, but even a hardware level, thanks to the fact that software is open source, right? And still being able to innovate and still at the same time sustain that innovation financially, even with an open source model, I think is incredible, right? And
I think there's a misnomer here that people equate open source to nonprofit.
Yeah.
And I do think that there are great examples of great business models that are built on top of open source communities, where enterprises pay for, let's say RHEL, right, on top of Linux, right, because they want version control and they want the security that comes along with sort of that upgraded open source world, but they get the innovation that's based on the Linux fabric. Mm-hmm. Blockchain's the same way, Hyperledger versus the IBM blockchain offer. So there's great examples, and I think the great news is enterprises are now embracing that at scale. I think for a while they were afraid, like .NET came in, it was a proprietary system, they wanted protection, and I think it slowed down the whole open source world for probably a decade. Until enterprises got comfortable again with what open source meant. I remember consulting at Razorfish to some of the clients, and some of the clients wouldn't touch Linux. They just thought, oh my God, I can't put my code out there. It'll expose my entire enterprise. And you can imagine the fear of that, right? Mm-hmm. So they would still buy their proprietary licenses and go down that path, and it cost them a lot of money to do that. Mm-hmm. I think now it's less. I think maybe in regulatory industries a little bit, but in general, I think the acceptance is there.
Wow, that's really interesting to think about, because in a world like today's, it's almost unimaginable to live without open source software, right? So much of what we do is powered by open source. Today's live stream is being live streamed by open source software stack.
I know. And think about the innovations that have been built on top of that, right? Yeah. How Zoom exists and what what we do, and sort of the added value on top that differentiates Zoom compared to some other streaming mechanisms, right? But Exactly. It is all based on the same efforts and code.
Even to your point, with enterprises embracing open source, even a company like Apple that usually doesn't open source stuff, right? Even their core for all of their operating systems, Darwin and that sort of stack, is open source and built on top of previous open source projects like BSD and the Mach kernel, right? So
Yeah.
there's so much stuff that's open source nowadays that we don't even realize and is powering all of our tech. And, since we're in talking about the world of tech anyway, I sort of want to take a quick detour before we come back, and I want to ask you, what exactly is the importance of having a technical background, regardless of the industry you work with, right? And I'm not saying that everybody needs to be a developer and code all day, but what exactly is the advantage that you get if you do know how to code, you know how to communicate with tech, regardless of your industry?
Yeah, so I actually have a really, really strong opinion about this. And at one point, Steve Jobs came out with a famous quote, probably about 10 years ago, saying he wished that everyone in the world was a developer or a programmer because it helps people think. And it does, as most of your community here is probably developers, but you take it for second, I don't know, it's sort of like your second nature to think about a hypothesis, and actually develop a theorem towards that hypothesis, and actually put together a problem-solving, a regression model to actually help you simulate what the end state may be, right? You just lay out things logically because you've been taught to think about that way, and you always are thinking about an outcome, right? I think that helps anybody right now in any kind of business situation. It's just a way of thinking. I don't think one is better than the other, but I do think understanding how programming language are developed, how you can actually structure it together, how you think about it, I think helps you in any kind of problem solving situation. And I think any philosophy major can benefit from a programming class. Any sociology major can benefit from a programming class. Because I just think that as human beings, the way we think about a problem and how we derive a solution is a really, really important skill that I have observed in the marketing world that has added value. So when I think about this convergence of creativity and technology, I actually wrote a book called Converge with my CTO at Razorfish, Ray Velez. And it talked about, these silos of organizations. It was the creative director and it was the CTO, right? And in the early 2000s, the two of them didn't talk, right? But ultimately, you wanted to create this great customer experience. It had to be enabled by technology. And at that point in time, we were only talking about e-commerce sites, okay, or marketing sites. But you wanted somebody to come online and experience the brand. So you needed the technology. You needed somebody who knew something about HTML5, right? And you needed the creative assets to overlap together. And if they didn't work together from the beginning, the experience fell apart on people. Either the site didn't work because the experience was too rich, or the site worked really well, but it didn't look very good, right? And it wasn't really appealing and didn't express the brand. So when you actually think about how this convergence of creativity and technology need to come together, having a creative director that understood HTML5, you made a lot more progress to actually get that experience right. Or having a developer understand what the creative process was about. And then you start thinking about, well, that's why Agile was really inherited. And that's why I think Agile now has permeated sort of business solution processes right now, right? Because it's about setting an MVP, right? It's about creating sprints. It's about driving to an outcome, but it's having an eclectic group of people and a diverse group of people to actually drive towards that MVP. So although that was born out of technology, that methodology is now being used to solve problems. I mean, all through IBM, any kind of problem that comes up, we're setting up a sprint. It's a 2-week sprint. We have stand-ups, 30 minutes, hopefully, no longer. They're stand-ups. Everyone stands up at the meeting. And you run through what are the blockers to actually get to that outcome. That was born out of the developer world, right? So the more that you understood that as a developer, the more you could adopt it for basic business problem solving. So I'm pretty passionate about this idea that learning the problem solving skills that you learn as a technologist are scalable across anything and anybody in business.
And I think there's a sort of unique angle that you've put in here that I haven't really heard from any developers at least, and that is, it's not even just the sort of raw problem solving capability that you learn when you learn how to code or when you learn about technology, but even the way that we go about building the technology, right? The agile methodology, the stand-ups, the sprints, these sorts of things that are sort of permeating out of technology and just generally into business because they're so useful, right? We can learn
Yeah.
from the field of technology that way. And,
No,
people
Tommy,
think,
just let me one
yeah,
really important point.
definitely.
Defining what an outcome is,
Yes.
right? In technology, outcome is a piece of code or it's an MVP, it's a launch of a website.
Mm-hmm.
There's a reality there. Like
Mm-hmm.
there's something you have to produce. In
Mm-hmm.
business, that's not always so clear. Sometimes it's just a PowerPoint.
Mm-hmm.
So you want to challenge the business to say, what is the outcome we're driving to? And then everyone celebrates what that outcome is, or you refine the MVP around that. So just the idea of the language is really, really important to your point.
Absolutely, absolutely. It's all about that sort of North Star. Where is it that you are actually going to, right? That North Star
Yes.
metric.
Yeah.
And, one thing that I kind of just want to mention is that we all happen to think that technology is a super like analytical, statistical, mathematical thing that we all sort of sit down. It's very structured to do things. But I really don't think that's the case, right? And I had a talk at the Creative Foundation in Winnipeg a little while ago, and the talk was obviously about creativity. And one of the sort of major points that I wanted to get across was that creativity, when we say creativity, our minds usually associate that with like, with music or with art, with these sorts of things. But creativity is really about how can we take novel ideas, right? Things that people haven't thought about before, things that sort of break conceptual or conceptual
Conceptual
wisdom.
speaking.
Yeah,
Yep.
wisdom, right? And my point was that even in the world of technology, right? Even though it might seem like you're doing, super technical and structured things, the way that all the little building blocks of tech come together and sort of work together, that is creative. That's an art.
That's correct.
Right? It's not something that you can sit down and derive mathematically. That's something you have to think
No,
about.
there is a ton of creativity that has to happen when you're doing any sort of technology build,
Yeah.
where you're going. And actually, I think some of the best developers are the ones that have sort of the left side of their brain working really, really hard
Yes.
with the right side of the brain, so that you merge the two together. It's been a really interesting experiment to sort of see businesses come together like this, because I've seen the movie in real time, and I've seen companies evolve, but I can tell you we're still not there. You walk into organizations, and the silos still exist, and the silos of creativity, the silos of media, marketing, and technology, they still there, and they are the antithesis of innovation for a company. And then that leaves the open door for that startup or that new technology company to come in, like a Tesla, to disrupt the auto industry, right? Everyone never believed that we could have electric cars. Now they're talking about using the Tesla engines in all cars worldwide, because the engine is so improved and so beneficial to potentially other providers. So, sometimes we still have a ways to go around sort of getting to that place where you see the convergence of all these skills and the diversity of thought to get you to a better solution.
Mm-hmm. That's so interesting because as you mentioned around like diversity, right? Because it's important to make sure that we have all these different opinions and different people that we can learn from, right? Going back to your first point, all this is connected at a very fundamental level, right? And a question that I actually have for you right now, and this is a question that we actually just got through the stream as well, just kind of worded a bit differently. So my question was, how can we actually instill this culture of lifelong learning that you mentioned, right? How can we actually get people to adapt that way? How can we make them have this open mindset to new ideas? But a much more interesting way of wording it, so we have a question from the live stream from Vinish. She's asking, how do oldies adapt to the change to stay afloat?
That's a really, really good question. And there are some people who just can't. Let's just start there. I think a third of the world at senior level managers cannot do it. They're kind of set in their ways. They have been successful in the current methodologies that they employ. They have been rewarded from a compensation standpoint for the way that they have behaved. and you're not going to change it. I do think that there are a third that are now in that mode. And then there's a third that are willing to learn and to move along. And I think it's about, for that last third, it's about proving to them that things can be done differently. So at IBM, part of what we've done at IBM is to be very diligent about creating pilots and then scaling the pilots up to convince the folks that are not in alignment with it. And the other angle is to take, as I said before, take the outside in approach and really sort of make the case for change based on either what the competitors are doing or what the customers are asking for. And then that sort of gets people backed into a corner and they're like, well, I can't do it the old way I used to do anymore. So I'll try this new way anyhow. So you got to work it from a couple of different angles on that last third of the folks that are there. Mm-hmm. But it's not an easy thing to do. And there's a lot of change management consultants running around trying to help enterprises do that because it's not an easy solve. What I will tell you though, is the generation that's coming up, you have all the power to bring that forward. And don't lose those principles. You graduate from college and you're sort of, or even high school, and you're part of this eclectic group of organizations, right? You're not in any silos. You're allowed to take any coursework that you want. You can go and collaborate the way that you want. All of a sudden you come into an enterprise company and you're part of the communications department, or you're part of the marketing department, or you're in the back office IT department. And you now are straitjacketed because you can't go out in any other silo within that organization. And you have to fight that. Mm-hmm. You have to sort of collaborate across the aisle, as you would say in politics, to go out into the environment and create these squads, these virtual squads, because it's not about an organizational change. It's about how we actually behave as a culture.
Mm-hmm. Right. It kind of boils back down to our original point of, at the end of the day, organizations and businesses are just collections of people, right? It's not like, the top level management can always just decree orders down and then that's just how it works. It's up to everybody in their thought process, their creativity, their ideas, everybody sort of coming together to be able to come up with this change as a culture. And you're right, it is sometimes really difficult for certain people to make that adaptation, but I think once they do it, it is beneficial not only for their own career, but even just generally for the rest of the organization, for the rest of the world, for to be able to drive innovation.
Yeah, and Tanmay too, in those solution teams, just make sure you bring enough diversity of thought there, mm-hmm. right? Sometimes you hire your own likeness, or you ask somebody in a squad because they think the same way you do. But you want the opposite. You want somebody who doesn't think like you in that squad because you ultimately come to a better solution.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Being able to take a look at a problem from different angles starts with fundamentally different ideas that grow to different solutions, right? Mm-hmm. And being able to collaborate, as you mentioned, exactly, across the aisle in that sense is really helpful. Now, a quick few questions from the live stream. I'm going to go ahead and ask you. We actually got a couple before the live stream. I'm going to ask you one of those. One of the questions that we got from Michael was, how can IoT technology affect supply chain?
Yeah, no, I think it's actually, so IoT, when you really think about the big hype around the Internet of Things, right? It was only 2 years ago. People were thinking about it as a standalone technology. The reality is, we're talking about computing at the edge, and actually empowering people to make decisions or compute at those edges in an IoT world. And I think when you start to think about the supply chain, it can allow decision making at the fringes of the supply chain that you can't currently do right now. I own the Sterling application, the Sterling supply chain application suite for IBM. And I can tell you we're embedding sort of IoT computing at the edges around the supply chain network, so that a supply chain manager can actually get the decisions made that they need to get made at that moment, at that time, so they can make critical decisions. We're using AI like anomaly detection to help them figure out. It sounds pretty simple, but it hasn't been used in supply chain. It seems like based on last month, this part of the supply chain is going to run out of orders or supply. These are the other 3 places you should look for. That intelligence we're trying to bring out of the application for folks. And then the last place is in the blockchain, using blockchain as a trusted transaction capability so that you can actually have supplier conversations and some kind of trusted transactions whether it's with state governments or whether it's with a regular supplier, but actually secure those transactions, because right now they're mostly done manually and they're done with paper. So there's a lot, I think, that IoT can help, as well as those other two technologies, to transform just the supply chain industry in general.
Wonderful. All right, so I'm going to ask you another quick question before we end our live stream today, and that is, and so this one actually came from Peter before the live stream, who's asking, I know you focus a lot on getting developers involved with the work that IBM does. Why is that important to you?
Yeah, this is a really big passion point for me. So winning the hearts and minds of the developer around the technology you have is probably the most important thing you can do as a technology company. And I remember when I was at Syracuse as an engineer, IBM had a really big presence there with the AS400, and you were sort of steeped in that technology. So when you went into your enterprise, as I got hired into General Motors or Corning Glassworks, you normally had this affinity to the IBM brand and the IBM culture over time and the software that was there. So you brought that to the company with you, right? And now in this new world where developers actually make 95% or influence 95% of IT buying decisions, it's more imperative now than ever. So when I came on to IBM, we had a thriving developer community, but I would suggest to you that it wasn't as thriving as our competitors. Mm-hmm. So I went headfirst into igniting the activities around developers. And we have now grown our active developer base to over 5 million folks that come to our development platform on a monthly basis. Wow. Which is kind of amazing. I mean, there's 24 million developers in the world, 25 million developers in the world, but they access our platform at scale. And that kind of, I would say, religion, or winning their hearts and minds, and we make it easy for them to solve problems, is really the core of what we're going to go at. At the end of the day, developers want to be great problem solvers. Mm-hmm. And if IBM technology can help them solve a problem around climate control or natural disasters, or we just had a competition around COVID, and we just had a competition around racial bias or embrace challenge, I mean, they will utilize our technology to help them solve those really hairy problems. We just have to help focus sort of what that problem is. So it's less, Tanmay, for me, as I learned, about teaching them a particular technology. It's more about laying up a problem to solve, and then elevating that in the open source world, mm-hmm. right? And making, which I believe, the developer of this generation is the civil engineer of the 60s. I mean, they're just the heroes that's re-architecting business right now. And we need to make them the Nobel Peace Prize winners or Nobel Prize winners in the development community. And I'm trying to do that.
Wonderful. That is amazing to hear. Thank you very much, Bob, for answering my questions. These insights were really valuable, right? I'm sure that, I've learned a lot personally, and I'm sure that the audience has as well. And before we leave today, though, I do want to ask you, is there a closing message that you want to share with our audience before we go?
Look, we talked a lot about a lot of things, and I mentioned it in the beginning. The most important thing that you can do is to have passion around what you do every day. Don't waste your career. I remember having a mentor saying, if I come in every day and I hate my job, I'm wasting my career, mm-hmm. and make a change. Because at the end of the day, you have to have some fun. Mm-hmm. And this is a journey. We have one life, and you should enjoy it. And I think given the skill sets that people and the potential people have, you don't want to waste your career, but you want to make sure that, as a leader, you have some fun along the way. And the only way you have fun is if you're tied to my first point, which is about being passionate about what you're doing on a daily basis. Wonderful. I'll leave you with that.
Thank you very much. I feel like that's something that, kind of seems like, oh, of course I should love what I do. But, when you really get down to it, it is much more important than you think on a high level, right? It's really important to make sure that whatever it is that you're doing, realize that that's going to pay off eventually, right? That's something that, as long as you're having fun going into work every day saying, I'm going to code today, or I'm going to, do whatever it is, right? It could be marketing, yep. It could be sales, whatever it is. As long as you're having fun they're going to be great at it. So thank you very much, Bob. It was an honor to have you on the show.
Thanks for having me, Tanmay.
Of course. I know you're really busy, and thank you for taking out the time. And also thank you, everyone, for joining the live stream today. Of course, on Sunday, we're going to have another special episode with 2 special guests, so make sure you join at 11 a.m. Eastern Time. So thank you, Bob. Thank you, everyone, for joining in today.
Hey,
and goodbye,
Thank
everybody.
You all.